Hello there, people. Welcome back. Today, we're going to talk about swarming and put it into context of the story sizing and the slicing conversation that we've had in the previous episodes. So stick with me, and I'll help to guide you through when to help your team to swarm and the techniques that I've used successfully in the past. See you there? I really appreciate you coming back. I keep getting calls from people about swarming and slicing and story sizing and some of the challenges that they've had. This has been on my mind a lot because this has been one of the bugaboos I've had to deal with many different teams. And I'm hoping that by creating this series of videos and having it out there where you can access it, you can review this and then hopefully have some success with your teams. A brief reflection on the previous episode, which was the slicing. We're going to talk a little bit about the frequent delivery concept, again, just to make sure that we understand that. We'll discuss terminology, slicing versus splitting, and we'll also discuss when to suggest swarming and when to leave the team alone. There will be some modeling that I'll show you some of what's going on and what to look for. Let me put this episode into context. We had the first episode, which was why small stories, an introduction to slicing. Then we discussed the user story slicing deep dive. Today we're going to have the swarming, these largish types of stories. You will recall that it was important for us to achieve a shared understanding of story points in order for the team to recognize when they needed to slice stories and to set a guideline. So as part of our working agreement, we came up with an agreement that anything greater than a 5 needed to be sliced or swarmed. It took me a while to get them to agree to that, but it is a necessary step. Then we used my Excel guideline to get them started on slicing while thinking of volume, the unknowns, complexity, lack of knowledge, and skills. Once we had that together, then we had a pretty consistent story sizing approach so that we could recognize with some confidence whether or not a story was big and if we should slice it, or, as we'll talk about today, or swarm it. We identified some patterns on the team, such as what the team being a little bit apathetic and that it was always used to doing things the same way. There was a lack of consensus on story pointing, a lack of attention to subtask details. That's another thing that helped to get them to start subtasking so that we could ensure that we understood how a story would be implemented and that everyone agreed that that's what had to happen. Before we talk about slicing and before we talk about swarming, you have to have a consensus on, well, how are we going to implement that story? New teams really should take the time to put subtasks on there. Not everybody does that. You can see that over here. Subtask details. We also agreed on what too large was. We eliminated the concept of development done. So a story is only done when it's developed, tested, and approved. We brought in the test first approach so that we made sure that developers and testers were talking. And we were hoping to eliminate the problem of too much work dropping in on the testers. Now, there were other issues that we identified, but again, those we elevated up to leadership and let them try and help with some of those because they required budgets and other types of things, right? You also recall then we went through the slicing concepts. Vertical slicing was what we had wanted. Always working code that went through all the architectural layers. The reason was that the sooner we tested our hypothesis, the sooner we delivered working code over to our testers and our users, etc., then we would discover if there were any defects or any improvements that were needed. The sooner you find them, the cheaper it is and the easier it is to fix it. The longer you hold it, the more cost there is to repairing it. So this is part of the driver for why we want to deliver in small increments. Okay, or small iterations that then result in increments. Now, there were two patterns that we didn't want to do, which was the horizontal slicing by process, right? You're basically recreating the waterfall SDLC, and that's an anti-pattern. You don't want to do that. The other one is you don't want to slice by architectural layer. In other words, one sprint you do the UI, then you do the business logic, then you do the service layer, then you do the data. That also was an anti-pattern. And I explained why, so I'm not going to get into much detail here. Go back to the other video, please, and you'll see. But those were anti-patterns. Vertical slices through the stories is the way we want to go. In swarming, what we may end up doing then is saying, hey, The team is not entirely convinced that slicing is possible. So how else can we shorten the duration without slicing? And there is a technique, and it's called swarming. Before we go into that, though, what I want you to understand is, how do you know if you should even propose slicing and swarming? I don't want people to get the idea that they should be pressuring the team to do this, whether or not it's valuable to them. And so I'm going to show you a couple of patterns here to look for, which is a stable team, which means that the team already has a successful pattern. And you may want to leave well enough alone. Remember, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So in this case, I want you to notice the blue column is the committed points, and the orange column is the delivered points, the completed points within the sprint. The yellow line is your velocity, average velocity, and the blue dotted line is your completed percentage. And you'll notice that there's a clear pattern here. Sprint over sprint over sprint. You have more points being delivered than what was being committed. You have 100% or greater. This team is extremely predictable, very predictable. Okay, they have a pattern down that works. I would not go in there and start saying we need to change how you work because they've already got an established pattern. And I would take another look at their cumulative flow diagram, here also referred to as a CFD. And this is a team that started off with, let's say, 30 points. They have a controlled amount. The yellow is the work in progress. And you'll notice that that band of work in progress is fairly narrow and controlled all the way through the sprint. Now you notice that Rally, came out of Rally, estimates the CFD in story points, not in count of issues. But let's take a look at that. All right. What this means is that the team here has a fairly stable sprint. They got to a certain point, they got some stories done, and they decided to bring in something else. Then they got some more stories accepted, and they decided to start bringing in more. At the end of the sprint, they had completed everything that they took on. This is a very successful sprint. All right, but the key thing to look at is your work in progress. Is your work in progress narrow and controlled? I'll show you a CFD later of a team that is not doing that. So if I saw that the team was stable, their predictability was high, and their CFD shows me that their work in progress is a narrow band, I don't mess with this team. And you shouldn't either. Leave them alone. Let them work. They already have a pattern that's working. Don't go trying to force patterns on them if they're working well. What you're looking for is when you see the anti-patterns, and that's when you use the metric to drive that. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just kind of model out what is happening on one of those teams, in a Scrum team, where you saw that good pattern. So here you have your team, and here you have your board. Now you notice that this Scrum board is extremely minimal. You only have ready, in progress, approval, and done. I don't like the way that this board is done, but it is very common to see Scrum teams that do this. And I'll explain later on why I don't like it. But as the sprint starts, here you're going to see the days going across. Here you have your product owner who's going to be approving things. And here you have your developers and your tester. Again, this team has a separate tester. Not all teams do. Sometimes the testing is done by the developers because developers can develop and developers can test. But in many teams, the job description for a developer does not include testing. And so testers have a very specific role. Scrum does not identify testers as a role. It just says developers. All right. But again, what Scrum says and what happens on many teams are often two different things. So I'm going to just point out a pattern that I've seen many, 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 many times. In this team, when the sprint starts, they start moving one or two stories into progress. But you'll notice that there will not be all the stories in progress. You're not going to see this, for example. Everything drops into progress. What you'll often see then is just two or three things, depending on the size of the team and the number of developers, 2 or 3 items in progress. And you'll see if you were to look at your burn down chart, it would start to look like this. You see that you're starting off with a number of points in the sprint, and then day 2, The team is talking about what they're going to work on. Your stand-up often sounds where the team members are talking to each other. Okay, today I'm going to work on this. Okay, I'm working on the API. Let's get together later so we can test it. Let's do a code review this afternoon. They're not reporting to the Scrum Master. They're talking to each other. That's another indicator that the team is collaborating and working closely together on the stories. So by day 3, what happens is now, boom, things start dropping over for approval. New stories start to come in, and you'll hear that conversation. I'm about ready to start user story 03. 01 is over for approval, and the product owner says, great, I'll get it approved by today. By the next day, this one is done. And user story 2 is over in approval, and at the stand-up, they'll say, hey, we've got user story 2 ready, and Carol, your product owner, says, great, fantastic, I'll look at it. Perhaps another story comes in, and as they're burning through the committed work, they might start grabbing from the backlog and bringing in stretch goals. All right? And what happens then on your burn down chart is it starts to look like this. By day 4 and day 5, you notice that you've already burned down a little bit, and now you're dropping down like this. User story 2 drops into the done, and user story 3, it goes over to approval. To abbreviate this conversation, you will notice that your burn down chart looks like a little step ladder like this, because stories are constantly getting done all throughout the sprint. This also means that when the stories are in progress, that development work is also being delivered over to your tester at some point early and often. And then it gets to the approval process early and often. The product owner is able to validate that it meets the acceptance criteria early and often. Okay? This is a great pattern that you're looking for. And if your burn down chart looks a little bit like this, you're probably doing a fairly good job, especially when your cumulative flow diagram looks like this. So you see how things are getting to done early and often, all the way until they complete the whole story. The burn down chart is valuable. A CFD is valuable. Most Scrum Masters do not use the cumulative flow diagram or CFD. You really should. You should be looking at not only your velocity, but your throughput and your cycle time metrics. Yes, that's right. I'm a Scrumban fan. I like to combine flow with Scrum metrics, right, and charts, because it tells me a lot about what's actually happening on the team. Now, on that same team, you should see another interesting pattern when you look at the subtasks. So here you have the stories, and you have your developers, and I want you to observe what's going on with the subtasks, and also what is going on or not going on with the other stories. So they're swarming a story. Multiple people are working on the same story at the same time. They've reduced their work in progress, and they're getting each story done one at a time. They might have 1 or 2 or 3 things in progress at once, but they won't have 5, 6, 7, 8 things. You may recall that I said that I like to use Scrumban. What that means is that I combine Scrum metrics with Kanban metrics. And this is a board that we used at a client where we created and combined several different types of metrics. And this tells you a team that's very healthy. And I'll show you what you're looking for, okay? First of all, look at your sprint burn down. The black line is the ideal and the green line is actual. You see a consistent burn down towards completed all the way through the sprint. And would it surprise you to say that their cumulative flow diagram shows early and often completion of work all throughout the sprint? Of course, it shouldn't surprise you. That's exactly what you would expect to see. And look at this. The in progress also shows you a narrow band all the way throughout the sprint. They've controlled their work in progress, their WIP, and they're getting work done all throughout the sprint. The red bars here shows where they violated their sprint. Something came up in the middle of the sprint, but it was only 3 days. They had a violation of their WIP for only 3 days. And they had a successful iteration. Their average cycle time, in this sprint, they had a 6-day cycle time. But this still tells me that their stories are being done quite quickly. On average, about 4 days, less than a week to complete a story. And in this particular sprint, some of them got hung up. Probably has something to do with this work in progress. My guess is production issues came in and they had to pause things while they fixed that. And again, you can see their predictability shows that they're highly predictable over time. Now, my point is very, very simple. Don't mess with a team like that. Leave them alone. The metrics demonstrate that they have a highly successful pattern. You do not need to push them to slice or to swarm. But I can almost guarantee that if you go and you analyze how they work, you're going to discover that they are slicing and swarming already. So now let's talk about how to recognize the patterns when things are not going well and where you may need to investigate and start thinking about introducing slicing or swarming. And today we're only focused on swarming. All right. What does that look like? So you will recall from the previous video that this team had a clear pattern, had a problem. They were overcommitting sprint after sprint after sprint after sprint after sprint. Then they would get one sprint where they delivered more than they'd committed to, and then they went back to the same pattern. But something was wrong. The overcommitment and unpredictability was an issue. So then we ask a series of questions in the retrospective to see if we can get them to agree that something's not working right. So we might ask, what pattern are we observing with our completed versus committed trends? Well, we're unpredictable. We're committing to more than we can get done. Why do you think that's happening? Well, maybe it's too many stories. Maybe the stories are too big. Maybe we have impediments. Maybe the requirements weren't clear and we have to keep working on them. Well, which is it? Let's analyze that and figure that out. What's the average story size of the stories? If your average story size is 1 or 2, that's one thing. But if it shows that your average story size is 3 points and they're being done in just a few days or a week, then probably the points are meaningful. So then you start looking for other symptoms. So does our burn down show plateaus? Are our stories too large? Yeah. Our burn down is showing plateaus and our story size is large. Okay. So at any time during the sprint, what's our whip count? Well, we're doing 1 story per developer and tester. So sometimes we even have a couple of more. Does the team demonstrate individual story ownership? Each individual owns a story or 2. So what techniques could we employ? We could commit to fewer stories. We could reduce our whip. We could promote collective ownership. So it's not assigned to individuals, but we work on it as a team. And we swarm the stories that can't be sliced. All right? Sometimes I'll start teams with swarming before I start them with slicing. What we would want to do then is look and see what is the pattern. How are they working on these stories? And what you'll notice right here when you look at the stories and the subtasks, you'll notice that Ramesh has a story he's working on. Lisa has a story she's working on. Sue has a story she's working on. Jane has a story she's working on. Individual ownership. They're all working on their subtasks. All right. There is no collaboration on this. And so everything is in progress at once. The problem is that many things are in progress and not everything is getting done. Your metrics already showed that. And the cycle time demonstrated that it takes longer than we would want to get things done. So this is one of the patterns to look for. Look at the cumulative flow diagram. I mean, holy free holies, people. Do you see what's going on there? They start off with about 20 points in progress. Now that could be 4 5-point stories, or it could be a 13 and a 5 and a 2, but it's a lot that's in progress at once, and it also indicates that they probably got too much in progress and some of it's complicated. You'll notice that this stuff here, the defined, which means basically it's ready for the team, this is fluctuating greatly, up and down. So that shows some instability you may need to address. But notice how also you don't start getting very much done until toward the end of the sprint. What do you think is happening to your poor tester on October 3rd and 4th? They're overwhelmed. And look at the end result. Did they get everything done? No. This is a team that should stop adding things early, reduce the work in progress, and try and get everything done within the sprint. So what does that look like at the team level? Well, you notice that what's happening now is every one of the developers has their story in progress. Shoot, in this case, there's 4 developers, and they may have 5 stories in progress at once. And early on, before they've even been able to indicate that they're making any real progress toward getting anything done, the product owner or somebody is already pushing in new work. Oh gosh, we committed to these, but we're already taking on stuff. We haven't even gotten anything done by, let's say, day 5 or 6. And it finally gets approved, let's say, down 7 or 8. But look at all the stuff that they've got in progress. These are the patterns that will cause a team to flub it up pretty badly. This is what you're looking for. Now, again, I can't see what's happening inside the internal team process, which is why I despise Scrum boards that do the ready in progress and done, or ready in progress approval and done. It does not tell me how the team is working. And this is why I prefer to take more of a Kanban approach. Kanban doesn't start off with an artificial, dreamy representation of what a perfect flow should look like. When you see teams that have the ready, in progress, and done, a lot of times what's happened is that someone, a coach or somebody, has said, we like for the team to work together on this stuff, and we don't want to create a mini waterfall where there's developers and then there's testers. Well, the fact of the matter is that many organizations, that's a reality. And the coach can't just eliminate those development practices just because he or she wants to. Kanban comes in and says, well, let's look at how we actually, what's our value stream? How do we actually deliver today? And once you have an idea of how you deliver today, then you can begin to look for ways to reduce waste and improve the process. So I would prefer that we started off with a more detailed board. And let's take a look at what this means. All right. So now we're back to the same team, but we're going to look at it a little bit differently. In day 1, stories start going into progress. Okay? And this, you'll notice, will go for several days. It's all in dev. So nothing is hitting test yet. And you might go for 5 days before the first one starts to drop into waiting for test. All right? And then what happens? Well, developers pick up another one and they start dragging in all this other stuff. All right. Now, Carl's been waiting. He's waiting and he's waiting. And now the first one comes over for test. Great. So he starts working on the test. But look what starts happening now. Now, developers on this team don't test. Developers develop and testers test. And so while he's testing this, more stuff got dropped in. He finally pushes it off for approval, picks up the next one, but guess what happens then? Another one drops in. You're starting to build up a bottleneck in this column where they're waiting for test. Okay? You're ready for dev, dev's in progress, waiting for test, testing, waiting for approval. Now, Carol finally picks it up. You're going to watch and see. How long do things wait for approval? I've seen product owners who do it immediately, and I've seen product owners who do not pick up the work for days. You will not know what's going on if you don't have this kind of granularity. But if you include the extra columns, you can actually begin to get cycle time metrics at any one of these and say, how often, or how long, I should say, do things stay in waiting for approval? How long do they stay in waiting to deploy or waiting for test? Is there a bottleneck in test? Are things stacking up like this? And so now we know that we have a problem. We have more developers than testers, and this is creating a bottleneck. And we have a product owner who is so busy, he or she cannot approve things. And when you look at your burn down, it looks like this. And you notice that what's happened here is everything was in progress, and finally something got done, and maybe one more little thing got done toward the end of the sprint, but everything else was still in progress. If you don't have this kind of granularity on your board, you don't have any way of taking snapshots and demonstrating to the team what is happening. If you use metrics and you use clear evidence of this is what's happening, here's the snapshot of the board, it's easier to persuade your team to try something new. You don't want it to be my opinion versus your opinion. Use your metrics, use snapshots of the board, create a presentation, show them this is what I observed on day 1, day 2, day 5, day 7, day 8. and interview people and say, hey, Carl, how come you're not getting everything tested? I didn't start getting stories until day 6. And then all of a sudden, on day 6, I had 8 things pop in. It's time to start talking about swarming. Finally, you say. So what are we talking about? Well, it's just like it sounds. Okay? Think about how bees swarm. They all come together to accomplish a goal, whether it's to gather pollen to make honey, or they get together and shake their wings to warm the queen, but they all work together toward a shared purpose. Ants also swarm, and they do so to accomplish amazing things. In this case, you can see an ant bridge. They've bridged together 2 different leaves so that they can crawl across and bridge that gap between those 2 leaves. Teams need to learn how to swarm as well. That's where they all come together and they share a purpose and an objective. As I discussed, you want to start off by understanding, how does the team work? Start building trust with the team. Don't try and force it on them. Establish a partnership with recognized technical experts to understand how they're working and what opportunities are there. Identify individuals who are willing to experiment. These are going to be your allies. Let the metrics act as the magic mirror that this is what I see going on. Mirror, mirror on the wall. Who's the highest performing team of all? Not you, my dear, right? This is what you're trying to accomplish. Prepare powerful questions to ask them, what do we observe? What are the metrics telling us? What's our whip? How big are the stories? What could we do differently? And always keep in mind that what may work fine for a Kanban team is probably not going to work for a Scrum team. But even Kanban teams need to have short cycle time. Then I guide the team to start creating a detailed subtask list. This is very important. You may think that this is a wasteful administrative task. Trust me when I tell you that I have found that very good developers, when they don't take the time to create the subtask, when they don't identify everything that has to be done, they will miss things. Eventually, they'll realize that they missed it. But this could cause your story sizing to be off, and it could put all sorts of issues into the team. So I encourage them in the beginning especially, let's do the details of the subtask, and I make a promise that once we show that we're stable, we're predictable, our cycle time is low, we are really just crushing it, all right? Our whip is under control. We will begin to remove the requirements of applying detailed subtasks. So I give them a goal to accomplish, and I tell them what I'm looking for to get rid of that, and they're usually willing to do it for a brief period of time. Okay, we'll do it as a learning exercise, but you promise that once we establish that we are stable and predictable and our whip is low, et cetera, we can stop doing that. Agreed. And here's where we look at the subtasks. And you may recall from my previous video, we also talked about identifying the step dependencies. This is another level of detail that few Scrum Masters ever look at when they're trying to help them. Ask the question, hey guys, when you do this work, are there steps that you do first and steps that you can do concurrently? In other words, you're looking for, does everything have to be in a serial manner, one after another, or are there things that can be done concurrently? So what we can do is reduce the duration of the story by doing some things at the same time. All right? And when you ask them, look for serial, threaded, all right, or things that have dependencies, step dependencies, and which things can be concurrent. And then you can identify it like this. You can begin to ask intelligent questions about what can either be sliced out or what could be worked together by different developers. Now, let me model out what I'm talking about. Okay? Here we have an API creation story. This was from a real customer, right? I've had to rebuild this from memory, so it may not be perfect, but it will give you at least the idea. And here are the subtasks that they had to do. They had to map the customer API to a canonical API that they were going to create. They had to normalize the incoming API. They had to write unit tests, write test cases, create business rules, write canonical API, write the automation test in dev, migrate to integration, test and integration, deploy to production. And again, the order of things is probably going to change. That's not reality, but I just want to demonstrate the concept. If you were able to only work one person at a time, it would look a little bit like this. On day one, you start with mapping the carrier API. And then day 2 and day 3, you're on task number 2, normalizing the API. It's all right. He's still working on that. Now he's over here. Then he says, okay, I'm going to start writing some unit tests. And then finally, maybe Carl comes in and he starts writing his test cases. And then they start to create the business rules. And that lasts a couple of days. And then they go on to the next one, which is writing the canonical API. It takes 3 days. So writing the canonical API is going to take you several days. And then they start to write the automation test, and that takes a couple more days. And then the developer hands it off to the tester, and he tests it in dev. It takes a couple of days. And then they go and they push it over to integration. I have it that it takes a half day. It might take less, but let's use round numbers. All right. And then they test in the integration environment. And that takes a couple of days. And then finally, they push it out to production. Now, this is true. All right. All the tests may be a little bit wacky and out of order and et cetera, et cetera. But when I first started working with this team, it took them 17 days to complete an API. 17 days. Think about it. In a 2-week sprint, you're looking at almost two full sprints before you could complete it. And it was because they had a single threaded process. Every story that they brought in was huge, and they'd had one developer working all the way through. Here's what it looks like right here, right? And here's how Ramesh would pick up his stuff and work on 1 day here and 2 days there, and then write the test case, and it lasted all the way to 17 days. So then what we did was we said, well, what can be done together? What step dependencies are there? And what can be done at the same time? And this is what we came up with, right? These didn't have step dependencies. All of these things could be done together, or these were all dependent upon this, but you could actually have somebody writing a get service and a put service and a post service. The unit tests were not dependent upon some of this. They could be done afterward, or it could be done at the same time if you're doing TDD. So anyway, so we did this analysis there. We determined a new pattern for working, and what we ended up with was that Lisa would pick up map the API, and Sue would normalize the API, and Carl would start his test cases on day 1. And then by day 2 or 3, you would start your business rules logic, while Sue would spend about 3 days writing the API. And then over here, about day 4, Carl started writing some integration automation, right? And unit tests were done by Lisa. Then you were able to test in the test environment. Okay, quickly migrate, and then test in integration. And you notice that since they had automation tests as well as unit tests, this wasn't manual testing, this was automated testing. So we were able to take a 17-day story and compress it down to about 8 days. In the same 17 days, we could actually complete 2 stories in the time that it took one person to do 1. Here's what it looked like from that kind of Gantt chart look, all right? You see day 1 and 2, you've got these 2 things going at the same time. This one gets done, and someone picks up the next task, and someone else picks up the other one. On this day, we actually had 3 people working simultaneously. On this day, we had 3 people working simultaneously. On this day, 2 were working simultaneously. Now, when you have all these developers then, all right, today you have 2. Well, guess what? The 3rd developer is working on something else on another story. And then they jump in. As soon as this is ready, they come in and they join. And so you're focusing primarily on one story at a time. And I want you to notice that these daily stand-ups then have a very different sound. Instead of individual developers reporting to the Scrum Master, what you begin to hear is the team talking to each other. They're all planning amongst themselves. The conversation, therefore, is collaborative, and it's not reporting out to the Scrum Master. Now, once we eventually added slicing to swarming, now we were able to complete the full feature much, much faster. Story 1, we completed in just a couple of days because we broke it into little pieces so that we would take and slice out, instead of doing the get, the put, and the post, let's say, or the delete, all the operations in the same story, we would actually do them little by little, get them done in a day and a half to 2 days, and then start the next part. And you can see how the team collaborated. And then by doing this, we were able to get the stories completed in less than 7 days, 6 days. Completed all the APIs, all right, all the operations. It was a much faster process. So within one sprint, we would get almost 2 features done. All right, so that pretty much concludes the concept of swarming. And so what I would encourage you to do now, go find the technical people on your team who are open to the idea, begin to build a relationship, begin to socialize the concepts, use your metrics and your observations, and see if you can build the case that you need to slice and swarm. Some teams I like to start with slicing. Some teams I like to start with swarming. It really depends upon what I'm observing there. All right. That team that I was just talking about before, I started with swarming and then moved to slicing because it was easier for me to get them to work together than it was for them to say, yeah, let's start slicing out the operations. Let me know if you have any questions. Put some comments in there. Like and subscribe. I really appreciate it. I would love any kind of interaction. If you totally disagree with me, put a comment down there. Otherwise, I think this might conclude the series on slicing and swarming and story sizing. Have a great day. Thank you very much. Bye.